Thank you everyone for joining us this evening for another Conservative Friends of the Commonwealth webinar. Tonight we're delighted to have with us Sir Malcolm Rifkind, who is one of only 5 ministers, I'm told, to serve 18 years across both the entire premierships of Margaret Thatcher and John Major. And I'm told it's also the longest uninterrupted ministerial service since Lord Palmerston. So someone with an amazing pedigree who inside and outside of Parliament has done numerous things, and even just recently was announced as the chair of the committee looking into the future of the Commonwealth Studies Institute. So very pertinent for a lot of you, I know. But without further ado, I'll pass over to Sir Neil and Sir Malcolm, who will be having the discussion this evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want me to say a few words, or do I wait for you? Yep.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, well, no, thank you very much for inviting me to be with you this evening. It's a great privilege for me. Perhaps just a bit of intro relevant to the Commonwealth, because I know your organization is centered around interest in the Commonwealth. My first experience of the Commonwealth was somewhat unusual. It was when I was a student and undergraduate at Edinburgh University in the 1960s. And at the age of 18, I took part in an overland expedition of 200 British students from all over the United Kingdom. And we drove ourselves in a convoy of 5 single-decker buses all the way from London to New Delhi, where we were expected. We'd been invited. And we drove right through Central Europe and then through Turkey and down through Syria and Jordan, Iraq, Iran, Pakistan, into India. And the idea was the brainchild of a number of people who wanted to ensure that the Commonwealth was not just about prime ministers and presidents meeting occasionally. It was also about young people, a new generation. I was 18 at the time, a new generation of young Brits and young Indians getting to know each other, and people from other Commonwealth countries. That was the positive side. The rather sad fact was that after we crossed from Pakistan into India, this was 1968, and after about 4 days, India and Pakistan went to war with each other. And we were somewhat marooned in India. So it was sad that 2 great Commonwealth countries had not been able to resolve their problems. Fast forward, as a minister, I was involved as Minister of State at the Foreign Office between 1982 and 86, dealing with Commonwealth issues as well as other aspects of foreign policy. And then obviously Foreign Secretary from 95 to 97. Most recently, 10 years ago, I was asked to be the British representative on the Commonwealth Eminent Persons Group. Sounds grander than it was, but we reported to the Commonwealth Conference of Heads of Government in Perth, Australia, back in 2011. And now I'm helping London University on this inquiry into the Commonwealth Studies Institute, whose future has become a matter of some controversy. Over to you.
Thank you for that, Sir Malcolm. I want to echo Paul's words in that it is a great honour having you with us today. I know we've actually discussed this off air, but how have you been coping in the past year in these unique circumstances?
Well, almost exactly like everyone else. I live in London. I've got a flat in central London, so I'm able, when I'm not at home, under the rules, one can take exercise. So I'm fortunate to have St. James's Park as my closest a place for recreation. And of course, in the early period of the first lockdown, there was nobody there. I had the park, not quite, but almost entirely to myself. It's normally very, very busy during the day. So for a period, I felt rather as the Queen must feel. You know, she lives when she's in London next door in Buckingham Palace, and she has marvelous gardens and a lake in the center of these gardens, which one's very rarely allowed to see unless you're Boris Johnson, who nowadays goes jogging there when he feels like it. So her gardens are as private to her as St. James's Park appeared to be to me for these glorious weeks. But now I just can't wait for us all to get back to normality, because even with this wonderful technology we're using at the moment, it's not quite the same, and it's not quite as satisfactory as an actual meeting of real people. We are real people, but meeting in a normal way.
Yeah. You know, whilst this event isn't solely going to be focused on Sir Malcolm's book, I do want to go over in some detail. It is a fascinating read titled Power and Pragmatism. I found it an amazing read, and I thoroughly recommend it to our listeners today. In the opening sections, you talk about the differences between a pragmatic politician and a conviction politician. Do you mind explaining both to our listeners, and maybe using yourself and others as an example of who would come under that category?
I'll give you an abbreviated version, otherwise we wouldn't have time for anything else. But what I'm trying to say is that essentially there are big differences between politicians in this country as well as other countries, whether you're right-wing or left-wing, conservative or Labour, and so forth. But there's also differences of personality and attitude. And so essentially it is quite useful, I believe, to think of those who get involved in politics, not just as professional politicians, but even in a more voluntary way, as either, in broad terms, they fall into two groups: pragmatists and what are called conviction politicians. So conviction politicians, Margaret Thatcher, I worked under her. She was always the great example of the conviction politician. You don't just do what is popular, you don't do what is immediately might seem important. You start with a basic philosophy and almost an ideology, not quite, but almost, and you try to work within that framework. Because if you're pragmatic, she was rather dismissive and so forth. The pragmatist doesn't not have values and beliefs and strong beliefs, but you really approach it the other way around. The main question, if you're a pragmatist, and I consider myself one, is not does it conform to my preconceptions, but will it work? You know, because if you're in politics, particularly if you're a minister or a member of parliament being asked to vote on some important measure, it's no use just following your enthusiasms. You actually have to try to establish what are the practical consequences. So these are the differences, but there's a caveat, as there always is. The reality is that conviction politicians can be very pragmatic a good part of the time, and pragmatists have strong convictions. So it's a difference of emphasis rather than a fundamental change. I remember Margaret Thatcher, in my presence, was once asked, Prime Minister, do you believe in trying to reach decisions by consensus? And we all knew that she had some contempt for consensus because it was all wishy-washy and it was a sort of lowest common denominator. To our astonishment, she said, yes, I do believe in reaching decisions by consensus. And we said, you do? And she said, yes, I do. And then she stopped. And she said, I believe there should be a consensus behind my convictions. In other words, everyone should agree with me. When she said that, I thought she was joking. And then as the years have gone by, I realized she was deadly serious. But she could be very, very pragmatic. I mean, we've got, for example, the whole issue of Hong Kong at the moment, which is worrying an enormous number of people. Now, once she realized that under international law, under the treaty under which we occupied Hong Kong, most of Hong Kong, after 100 years, automatically went back to China. And she became a pragmatist. The issue then became, it wasn't like the Falklands, where there was no problem of legality. These were British islands, and we had the physical means of protecting them, as we showed. In Hong Kong, the circumstances were utterly different. She became pragmatic. And the question was, what is the best way we can try and help to protect the freedoms of the people of Hong Kong? Now, that did work for 27 years. This is way back in 1997, 24 years, I should say, 24 years. It worked pretty well. Sadly, in the last 12 months, that's no longer true. So you cannot always judge what the future will hold, but you can do your best. So that's the way I would introduce the distinction between, so it's not a distinction of absolutes, pragmatism and conviction politics. It's where you come from and the extent to which, in the face of the facts, you are prepared to adapt. Lord Keynes famously said, if the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do? Good question. I'm not sure if you ever got an answer.
It's fascinating that you mentioned Hong Kong there. You know, your journey into politics is a really interesting one, and especially as you've seen from the offset to have an interest in foreign policy. Two fascinating trips in the book you describe were India and Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. What was so telling about those trips, and how did that play a part in your future in politics? Because Britain was at a very interesting point. You know, they had almost come towards the end of the British Empire. So how did that play a part in your future politics?
I should say, for the benefit of the audience, that my trip, as I've said, to India was as a student traveling over land, and it was a great adventure, but it had a serious purpose of Commonwealth relationships. I spent just about a year and a half living and working in Rhodesia, as it then was called, Southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, and I had a job teaching at the university there, but I was primarily there because I was doing my postgraduate master's degree, and I'd chosen to specialize in African politics. And my professor in Edinburgh said, if you're going to specialize in African politics, it would help if you'd actually been to Africa, which was a pretty powerful point. And I said, well, I'd love to go, but I'll need to find a job because I didn't have any private means. I'll have to be supporting myself in some way. And he said, I'll see if I can find what the possible jobs might be, which was very good of him. And he came back a week later and said, I found 2 possible jobs. I said, what are they? He said, the first is doing field work in the Sudan, 200 miles south of Khartoum in the middle of a civil war. I said, you did say there was 2 possibilities. What's the other one? And he said, the other is an assistant lecturer at the University College of Rhodesia, which was linked to London University at that time, in Salisbury, now Harare, a glorious climate. And of course, it was in the middle of the UDI period, Unilateral Declaration of Independence. So for anyone interested in politics, it was a marvelous opportunity to see it firsthand, this extraordinary rebellion and how it was going to proceed. So I said, well, that sounds much more attractive. I'd love to do that job. How can I possibly get that job as an assistant lecturer? I'm not qualified. At that time, I only had a law degree, and this was to be lecturing in political science. And I promise you, my professor said, don't worry, they're desperate. And so it turned out that's exactly what they were. And I got the job, and I was there for a year and a half, met my late wife there. And so it had long-term personal consequences, as well as a fascinating ability to see a bit of the empire, the very last gasp of the empire, I suppose, as Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, battled for understandable political change.
In your book, you know, arguably one of the most prominent figures in there is Margaret Thatcher. You know, it's fair to say you two had a fairly mixed relationship at times.
How nicely you put it.
How would you overall describe your time as a cabinet member of our administration? And also, where do you rank Margaret Thatcher in terms of the prime ministers we've had?
Okay, I did have some very serious differences and problems with Margaret Thatcher, but I feel incredibly privileged to have served in her cabinet. 3/4 of the time, I could have followed her to the ends of the earth. The other quarter, I could have cheerfully throttled her. When she was good, she was very, very good, and when she was bad, she was horrid. In my case, it's quite easy to explain what went wrong. For the first part of my direct contact with her was before I was in the cabinet, I was a Minister of State in the Foreign Office, and I was very much involved with our policy towards the Soviet Union. And I was one of those, along with the Foreign Secretary, who arranged her meeting with Mr. Gorbachev, and all that flowed from that, where she was hugely successful at helping end the Cold War without a shot being fired. So I was very privileged to be, as it were, not just an observer, but in a very modest way, a participant in that extraordinary meeting. I was there when Gorbachev arrived at Chequers, and I was involved in the policy itself. So on foreign policy issues, I was pretty close to her, and we didn't have any problems, and we got on very, very well. When I went into the cabinet, she appointed me as Secretary of State for Scotland, which I was very happy to do. I was a Scottish Member of Parliament at that time. Margaret Thatcher's problem, she meant well, but she couldn't quite understand Scotland. When she thought of Scotland, she thought of Adam Smith and assumed that all the Scots must be potential merchant adventurers with a great belief in free enterprise, and therefore potentially, why aren't they conservatives? And the reality was that 2/3 of them were solidly, at that time, supporters of the Labour Party, and the Conservative Party was a minority party. So she wanted to implement Thatcherism in Scotland. And in some of that, I could happily go along with her. For example, the right of council tenants to buy their homes was actually very popular in Scotland. So that was fairly straightforward. But there was a range of other issues, which I won't bore you with the detail, on which we did not have the political legitimacy to make such radical changes, which did not have the consent of the majority of Scots. In England, the Conservative Party was the government because it had won an overwhelming majority of English votes. It had a political, not just a constitutional right to decide the law. In Scotland, we had the constitutional right. It was the days before a Scottish Parliament. There was no devolution. There was only one Parliament for the whole of the United Kingdom. But nevertheless, you could not ignore the political reality that we got something like, in a good year, 25% of the vote, and only had about 20 of the 70 MPs. So I had to keep saying to her, yeah, in principle, what you're wanting me to do in Scotland is a good idea, and we can do it over a period of time, but it's going to take a lot longer, and it's going to be done in a different way to reflect Scottish circumstances. One or two of my Scottish colleagues, including one or two of my junior ministers, like Michael Forsyth, as is well known, who was a future Secretary of State for Scotland, he was a great Thatcherite, and he was basically whispering in her ear the opposite argument, that we must be bold and we must do it, and eventually we'll get the political reward. So that, I'm afraid, created some problems. I could go on, but I won't, unless you want me to.
Yeah, well, I would love to hear more about Scotland. In the book, you really are a huge advocate of the devolution of Scotland, but you were also, strongly in favour of keeping Scotland in the United Kingdom. Now more than ever, seems very relevant. With the SNP driving the Scottish independence agenda. Explain the rationale to a lot of our listeners behind supporting the devolution of Scotland, but also thinking it's very important to keep Scotland in the United Kingdom.
Okay, first of all, I start from a very simple premise. I am a very committed unionist, always have been. That is my interest in devolution was how within a United Kingdom can you actually respect and respond to the aspirations, not just in Scotland, but in Wales, in Northern Ireland, in the regions of England, to less centralized control in London and more local control over your own affairs. So that's entirely consistent. There are many countries around the world that have what are called federal systems. The United States, Canada, Australia, Germany, and many others. So you can have a single overall international state, but you have a high level of decentralized government, and in a federal system, it goes much further than we have at the United Kingdom at this present time. Why am I a unionist? Because we're a pretty small island, if you look at the map of the world. And it's also, I think, undeniable that the union has been an enormous success. Scotland and England used to be the old enemies. Scotland's allies used to be France or the Netherlands or whatever. And yet since 1707, which is now over 300 years, Ireland has sadly been a different circumstance, which I won't go into at the moment. But so far as Scotland, England, and Wales are concerned, that is a union which has been peaceful, where people have worked very well together. We've had no system of government that was not moving consistently towards more democracy, more personal liberty, and more freedom. And the people of the United Kingdom shared that political liberty. And of course, it included the period of the British Empire, when the Scots made a disproportionate contribution to the people who occupied the senior posts of administration of that empire. So the empire is now the past. That's no longer relevant to the issues you have asked me about. But what would it say to a world that is trying to work together, that is trying to resolve political problems by peaceful means and by international solutions, if the single best example the world has seen is in historical terms of old enemies living together peacefully for 300 years, now concluded they had so little in common with each other that they had to break into separate political entities. And in any event, there is something bizarrely unconvincing about the Scottish nationalist position, because what they say is, as soon as they become independent, they would want to join the European Union. Now, whatever you think, whether you're a Remainer or a Brexiteer, that's not the point I want to argue. I was actually a Remainer. But whatever your views are, the one thing that is clear is that by being part of the European Union, you surrender a significant part of your national sovereignty. That's what the EU is, not all of it, but a significant part. That's what the EU is all about. So is it really convincing that the Scots today, according to the SNP and Mr. Sturgeon, have so little in common with England that we cannot share political institutions any longer, but they are willing to share political institutions which also involve a loss of sovereignty with the countries of the European Union? And it's a final point on that, if I may, it's worth remembering that although Scotland did indeed vote to remain in the EU, almost 40% of Scots voted to leave, and that included 1 in 4 SNP voters. Why? Quite logically, they said, what is the point of becoming independent from England if we're going to hand power over to Brussels? That's not why we became nationalists. So, you know, these issues are, all I say is these issues are much more complex than some of the commentary you occasionally hear from both sides of the argument.
That's a very interesting point. It's something that we don't really hear much about.
You'll be hearing a lot more, not just from me over the next 2 or 3 years, I suspect, because the nationalists are going to win the elections in Scotland, barring a miracle. They're not going to have a referendum conceded, but the issue will increasingly dominate British politics, particularly now that Brexit is behind us, hopefully, as a dominant issue. And I'm afraid, unless some very good fortune develops, this will be the big issue in terms of the United Kingdom political scene for a few years to come.
I think another big issue we've had, or a country that we regularly talk about, and there is so much we can discuss with you about when it comes to Russia and the Soviet Union. And you just mentioned about how you were very much involved from the early stages with Mr. Gorbachev, and you saw the Soviet Union split up. And one of the questions is, what was that like, seeing that unfold? And also, you mentioned in your book how Gorbachev was a leader with special qualities. It's clear that there are some very stark differences between Mr. Gorbachev and Vladimir Putin. What was it like working with Gorbachev?
Well, he was an extraordinary man, because up till then, all the Soviet leaders, not just I, but also my more senior colleagues had met, were very ideological. They were very distant. You couldn't really have an easy conversation. You never knew about their family, their personal life. Now, when Mr. Gorbachev came to see Margaret Thatcher, he brought his wife with him, Raisa. And she was a very important lady in her own right. She was a philosophy graduate, but she was also very elegant, very well dressed, unlike most Soviet political wives. And I remember at Chequers, the Prime Minister's residence, where she met Gorbachev, after the lunch, when on the morning they arrived, she and Gorbachev went off to have a tete-a-tete, just the two of them, plus interpreters. The rest of us were not involved in that. And I was asked to look after Madame Gorbacheva, his wife, Raisa. So I was showing her around the library at Chequers, which is a very fine library. And she was a very, almost what used to be called a blue stocking, rather academic, rather serious lady. And she knew a bit of English, but she was speaking mainly in Russian through the interpreter. And in the library, she was looking at some of the books. And she turned to me and she said, "I'm so delighted to be in England. I've always wanted to be in the country of Hobbes and Locke." Now, to mention two English philosophers of the 17th century, or round about there, is not what you got from the average Soviet wife, or even politician for that matter. So, immediately one could realize that we were dealing with a different class, in the best sense of the word class, of Soviet leader. And of course, he was, it's worth remembering what happened between him and Thatcher, because in theory, they should have disliked each other intensely. She was the Iron Lady, so-called, because of her hostility to communism. He at that time was still a convinced communist. He hadn't yet become leader of the Soviet Union, but he was already in the Politburo and seen as a likely future leader. So why did they get on so well? I'll tell you why. Not because they had several hours of discussion across a whole spectrum of issues. And at the end of these discussions, they agreed on virtually nothing. Neither had persuaded the other. However, two things had happened. The first was they found that they actually rather liked and respected each other. because they each had an incredible curiosity for the outside world and how it could be all addressed. Gorbachev was fascinated by the wider world, by what was happening in non-communist societies, and so was Margaret Thatcher. So they began to like each other. But even more important in terms of history was they began to trust each other. Sometimes, trust is something you get to have a conversation with somebody, and this is true of all of us. Some people, you can meet them and you think to yourself, well, I wouldn't like to have to depend on them. I just cannot trust what they're saying or what they're doing or whatever. To trust someone doesn't mean you have to agree with them. It just means you sense the chemistry works, and you sense that if they give a commitment or if they indicate what they're going to do or whatever, you can take that seriously. And that's why when Thatcher came out of that meeting, she said famously, I've just been talking with Mr. Gorbachev. I think he is a man with whom we can do business. Now, she didn't just say that in a press conference. That's what she reported and said to Ronald Reagan, President of the United States. And Reagan was as right-wing as she was. If he'd been told that by anybody else, he would have been pretty dismissive, some wishy-washy liberalism. To be told by the Iron Lady that we could do business in her judgment with Gorbachev, Reagan sat up. And that is what led, directly and indirectly, to the end of the Cold War within 3 or 4 years, without hardly a shot being fired or a person killed, which no one would have predicted years earlier. Now, I'm not saying you can replicate that in its entirety today. Putin is no Gorbachev. He's not that sort of guy. And Xi Jinping in China at the moment is not showing that he has the flexibility, the curiosity, the interest in finding solutions, because all real solutions ultimately depend on compromise. And it's the extent to which both sides can compromise is how you bridge differences in a way that each can sell to their own country and to their own political interest. But what I do believe, and what the Gorbachev-Thatcher thing I think helps prove, is that dialogue between political leaders is crucial as a first step towards resolving many of these issues. We tend to, when political leaders meet, we call them summits. I think that's a very serious mistake. I know why it happens, but it's still a wrong terminology. Because they're summits and sound so hugely important, then if they don't, having met for a couple of days, reach total agreement or substantive agreement, the summit is a failure. No, it should be the other way around. You should have these talks, these exchanges should continue regardless, indeed because of the differences that exist. And they won't always succeed. Sometimes even after several years, you won't have got very far. But occasionally, you will begin to find solutions. Just finally, if I may give another example, because Gorbachev and Thatcher were not unique. Think, this goes back quite some time, when Yitzhak Rabin was Prime Minister of Israel before he was assassinated. He had formed a relationship with Yasser Arafat, the head of the Palestine Liberation Organization, on a way forward of reforms that could lead to what became known as a two-state solution, which sadly has never actually happened. When he was assassinated, I was at the funeral along with John Major. And I then, the following day, went to Gaza to see Yasser Arafat as a quite separate visit. And I'd met him before several times, and normally we had an hour and a half. And after 40 minutes, he said to me, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to make this a shorter meeting because I'm going to Leah Rabin, Rabin's widow. I'm visiting her in Israel to pay my condolences. Now, think of that. Here you had people who had been sworn enemies, and yet Arafat, who I never particularly admired, but Arafat was big enough to wish to pay his condolences to the widow of the Israeli prime minister. Nelson Mandela is another example, along with de Klerk, who managed to form a relationship, or having been bitterest of enemies, and they delivered jointly, not just Mandela, not just de Klerk, jointly they delivered the end of apartheid peacefully and enabled to launch a new democratic South Africa. So Gorbachev and Thatcher, or Gorbachev and Reagan, were not unique. There are other examples, but it requires a lot of hard work and a lot of commitment.
A country you mentioned then, and it's talked about a lot in our platform, especially the last year, is China. In your book, you mention how China rule by law, not in the rule of law. How do you feel about China currently, and how much of COVID-19 should we be holding the CCP and President Xi accountable for?
Okay, I think the starting point has to be, we should not spend a huge amount of time wondering why or how China is now the other great superpower along with the United States. China should have been where it is now 50 years ago. If it hadn't been for the lunacy of Mao Zedong and the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward and all the other failed policies, China would have been that. Now, that's not just my personal view. If you look at China's neighbors, you find two things very relevant to the question you were asking me. First of all, where China is today in terms of its economic progress, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong were all there 50 years ago. They went through that same economic revolution 30, 40, 50 years ago. So there's no Chinese communist miracle of why China has now got rid of a lot of its poverty and has become a very advanced economic society. It is because Deng Xiaoping, not the present guy, Deng Xiaoping 30 years ago, created what he called communism with Chinese characteristics, which was a euphemism for capitalism. Now, it's not the same capitalism as we have in Britain or the United States. It's state capitalism. The state still controls so much of the economy. But there are more billionaires in China than there are in the United States. So it's not exactly an example of communist society as Mao Zedong was led to wish to see achieved. But there's a second point I would make highly relevant, and which disproves the kind of arguments you get from Beijing. When I say that Japan and Taiwan and South Korea all became prosperous 40 years ago, of course, they also either were or became democracies. They didn't need communism and a totalitarian state in order to deliver economic progress. Japan has been a democracy since 1945. Taiwan and South Korea were dictatorships, got rid of their dictators, and are both flourishing democracies. So when Xi Jinping implies, why don't you look at the Chinese model? Look at the economic progress we've achieved, and we couldn't have done that without the power and control of the Communist Party of China. Absolute rubbish, absolute bunkum. First of all, they'd have done it 50 years ago for the reasons I've mentioned. Looking at the rest of Asia, and not forget West, forget America, forget Europe. Just look at their own neighbors. They would have done it 50 years ago. And these other countries have done it not by surrendering liberty and freedom to a dictatorship, but by actually creating healthy, functioning democracies. So what does that mean today? It means that, okay, we have this elephant in the room called China, Communist China. Xi Jinping is not just the successor of previous governments, he's much worse. He has in his years in power, sadly, reduced what liberty there was in China. What he's doing for the Uyghurs with concentration camps in the west of China for millions of people is disgraceful. What he's done in Hong Kong is disgraceful. And of course, he's also antagonized by his foreign policy all his Asian neighbors, quite apart from Europe and the United States. Now, I do not argue, for exactly the reasons I mentioned earlier in relation to Gorbachev, that means we should isolate China or try to isolate them. Nor do I believe it's the beginning of a new Cold War, because China, despite all the problems that I've touched on, it's not the kind of threat that the old Soviet Union was. The Soviet Union was a much more serious threat during the Cold War for two reasons, neither of which apply in the case of China. First of all, the Soviet Union wasn't just Russia. It was trying to export a global ideology called communism. And in those years, we have to remind ourselves, communism was very seductive in many parts of the world. Even in France and Italy, The communist parties were the largest parties for 30 or 40 years after 1945. And in Latin America and Africa and parts of Asia, communism was seen as the future. Now, there is no ideology that communist China calls itself communist China, but it's not seeking to export a communist ideology. The Communist Party is simply the way it controls China itself. But it's not, it's saying we are a good example, in their view, of how to get rid of poverty and create progress. I've tried to suggest to you that that just doesn't carry weight, because their Asian neighbors didn't need to give up freedom to do that. So that is the first reason why it's not like the Cold War. The second reason, of course, was during the Cold War, the Soviet Union already controlled half of Europe, including half of Germany, right up to Frankfurt almost. So if war had broken out, the Soviet Union already occupied Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia, East Germany. Now Russia doesn't even begin to 1,000 miles further to the east. And Russia, although it is an important country, it's quite a powerful country, it has a lot of nuclear weapons, but it's actually also a failed country. Unlike China, it has failed to use the last 30 years to modernize its economy. It relies entirely for its wealth on oil and gas and minerals. What do we buy from China? They're from Russia. Apart from some countries, many countries buy their oil and gas, but what manufactured goods do we buy? Virtually nothing. Some countries buy some weapons, some caviar. There's not much else. It is a failed economy, and that is Putin's responsibility.
You've touched quite a bit there on Russia and China. I also want to bring in some that's happened in the United States of America. You know, when you got involved in politics, there was essentially no email, social media, Facebook, Twitter. Now, now it's evident that it's changed the nature of politics quite dramatically. What changes have you noticed in particular? And this also follows on to my next question on censorship. So it's quite a talking point on our platform. You know, we saw Twitter ban Donald Trump from their platform, which started a massive debate with many stating they feel the action may have been politically motivated and infringement on free speech. What was your reaction to the Twitter censorship move?
Well, the first point I would make is that the most exciting thing about what's going to happen tomorrow is that at least during the Biden presidency, we will not have a president of the United States trying to make foreign policy, never mind domestic policy, by Twitter, by waking up in the morning and deciding on the spur of the moment what he was going to share with the wider world, sometimes on the most sensitive political issues, which coming from anyone else wouldn't have mattered so much, but from the President of the United States immediately caused crises with half a dozen countries around the world every time he tried to do that. So it is a pretty stupid way of conducting foreign policy, but only one of the minor sins of Donald Trump over the last 4 years. Say again, what was the main thrust of your question?
It was regarding censorship. So, Twitter banned
exactly right.
Trump.
Right. The way I would think what happened was correct for this reason. Of course, it is a pretty serious matter to block the elected president of any country from speaking to his supporters or to his people or to the world through Twitter or through Facebook or whatever it might be. It's a pretty serious matter. However, it is also has to be borne in mind that precisely because he is the president of the United States, that if he chooses to speak in a way that is inciting violence or distorting the truth, then that does a huge amount of damage around the world. So I reluctantly came to the view that they were quite right. Normally, I don't believe in censorship. I don't like the idea of people being removed from social media platforms. But I think you have to bear in mind that just as we expect Twitter or Facebook to stop people who are encouraging child abuse or murder or racist attacks and so forth, that is broadly accepted. I'm afraid Mr. Trump to a terrible degree, falls into that kind of category. Disregard for the truth, an assumption that what he's saying is much more likely to be lies than truth, but also in a particularly aggressive and unpleasant way. So I think the office he held, which he degraded, but the office he held made it necessary for Twitter and Facebook to say, well, the damage that can be done, which we will ultimately be responsible for. And a final point, if I may, I know there's been this controversy with the social media trying to say, we are not publishers like newspapers. We are not responsible for the content of what people say on our platforms. I don't think that argument washes, to be frank. I think they are much more like newspapers. And just as if a newspaper publishes me saying something defamatory or inciting the law, breaking the law, then they can be, the newspaper itself can be subject to legal action. I see no convincing reason why in the real world in which we live, something of that kind should not also apply to the social media. Now, there are different problems of enforcement because these are global organizations. So it will require much more discussion between all the major countries as to how to establish an acceptable regulatory system, which is acceptable to people who share liberal democratic values and doesn't give censorship, as it were, respectability, because it doesn't deserve respectability unless it is used for what is a profoundly proper purpose.
We mentioned Donald Trump there, and often when we mention Donald Trump, there's always a question of what people think of the current state of democracy. Many on our platform have said that they feel the world is very polarized and people are no longer able to debate with each other or essentially be around people who think different to them. Now, I want to bring this up because I've heard you talk about from 1989, it almost seems like we were heading into a new age of liberal democracy. What do you think's gone wrong or right since we talk about democracy broadly?
I am very sensitive to this issue, but I think we have to get it in perspective. What we saw at the end of the Cold War was not just the end of the Cold War. There was an incredible flourishing of democratic, rule of law-based governments and societies around the world. First of all, you had all of Eastern Europe, apart sadly from Russia and Belarus, but Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, the Baltic states, and others, all becoming functioning democracies. You had Latin America, which used to be a byword for military coups d'etats and generalissimos. Today, the whole of Latin America, every country apart from Cuba and Venezuela, now have functioning democracies, not all perfect, but infinitely better than they've had in their history. The Far East, countries like South Korea, Taiwan, Indonesia, the Philippines, and so forth, important big countries, which were dictatorships, are now democracies. And increasingly, even in Africa, which always used to be very poor in democratic states, there are now a dozen countries where their heads of state or governments are changed to the ballot box and not through coups d'etats or revolutions or what have you. So this has been a huge plus. What we have seen in recent years is a regression. In some countries, they've gone backwards. And of course, in the Trump sense, Trump has been part of that phenomenon, but we've seen it in Poland, we've seen it in Brazil with Bolsonaro, we've seen it in Hungary and one or two other countries. The point I would like to make is you have to look at this historically. It is not unusual in the history of Europe and then also the history of the world that when you have some great social and political change, it goes marvelously in a particular direction, and then there's a reaction against it for a period of time. Think of the Reformation. What was the Reformation hundreds of years ago followed by? It was followed by, in Europe, the Counter-Reformation. And the Counter-Reformation did succeed in re-establishing Catholicism against the Protestant countries of the Reformation, but they didn't get rid of the Reformation, and a new equilibrium was created eventually in Europe. Think what happened in the 20th century, before the Second World War. democracy was under much greater threat than it is today. Think of the European continent. Countries like Germany had Hitler's Nazi regime. Italy had Mussolini. Spain had Franco. Portugal had Salazar. Russia had Stalin. And I could give half a dozen other examples of smaller countries. And it looked for a period of time as if democracy was literally going to be extinguished from Europe. And if Hitler had won the war, it would have been. What then happened was after 1945, you not only had a revival of democracies, but now the countries of Europe, certainly of Western Europe and most of the countries of Eastern Europe, are establishing have established. France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Greece are now countries where democracy is unlikely to be dislodged in the foreseeable future. So what I'm therefore coming to, in a rather roundabout way, is that what has been happening over the last few years, which people talk about the decline of democracy, it's a decline from a high, but a new equilibrium is being formed. In historical terms, if you think of it in terms of generations and hundreds of years, the onward march of liberty, of human rights, of the rule of law, of prosperity, of an end to poverty, that continues. And it's not uninterrupted. It's 3 steps forward, 1 step back. That has been the history of Europe, it's been the history of the world, and I think it's what we're going through at the moment.
One thing I very much agreed with you on was your decision many years ago to vote against the House of Lords reform proposed by Nick Clegg. He, if I remember correctly, wanted there to be elections for House of Lords. And one of the reasons I disagreed with him is I firmly believed in James Madison's belief when he drafted the US Constitution. He believed you should prevent necessarily people from having a direct role in government in order to protect public policy and liberty. Hence why the idea was to have the senators who would offer more calmness and reason rather than the impassioned members of the House of Representatives. Was your thinking similar?
Yeah, it was similar, yes. I mean, we all have slightly different points of emphasis. I disliked what Clegg was doing because he hadn't thought it through. I have no great devotion to an unelected House of Lords. Indeed, I'm beginning to think that a House of Lords, the very name itself, is redolent of a previous age. And maybe we should be thinking of something slightly more modern as our upper house or alternative chamber. But what was wrong with Clegg's point in particular was if you create an elected House of Lords, whatever you call it, then it will believe it has comparable democratic legitimacy to the House of Commons. And Clegg was going around saying, oh, no, House of Commons will remain the predominant chamber, the House of Lords will not change its role, it's simply the way in which we choose its members. I thought that was dishonest, or certainly ill thought out, because it is inevitable that if the upper house is subject primarily to election to any significant degree, it will feel that its job is not just to give the House of Commons the opportunity to think again on proposals before that have been approved by the MPs. It will be more like the American system, and the system we had in Britain till 1910, when the House of Lords did have the power of veto. If you couldn't get both chambers to agree, it couldn't become law. And that's what's true in the United States. And so if Clegg had been prepared to own up to that, then some would still not have approved of what he was trying to do, but at least there would have been a consistency. It would have been a well thought through reform. People would have had to make up their own mind whether it was a good reform or a bad one. So it was the amateurishness and the pretense that everything will change, but nothing will change, that seemed to me did not deserve support.
There's been a number of questions that we've had in from our audience, so this will be the last one from me. Now, you served under 3 different prime ministers, Margaret Thatcher, who you've obviously discussed, John Major, and David Cameron. Which one of the 3 would you say you enjoyed working with the most? And
well, I didn't serve as a minister under David Cameron, but I did chair the Intelligence and Security Committee. which is the committee that has oversight of MI6, MI5, GCHQ. And in those days, Cameron, as Prime Minister, was the person who appointed me to that role. Having appointed me, the committee under my chairmanship persuaded Parliament to change the rules so that the committee would become completely independent of the government of the day, to a degree that it wasn't at that stage. But to answer your question, I got on extremely well with John Major. I have a great deal of respect for him. And of course, I served him as his Foreign Secretary, and before that as Minister of Defence. So I was a much more senior member of the government. Although I was in the cabinet under Margaret Thatcher, as Secretary of State for Scotland, I was at that appointed when I was only 39. So I was a relatively junior member of the cabinet. So they had different strengths and weaknesses, he says diplomatically. But I think that Thatcher clearly was an extraordinary phenomenon. And John Major was a highly competent Prime Minister, a very impressive Prime Minister, but he wasn't one of the greats, and he'd be the last person to claim that. Thatcher was one of the greats because of her extraordinary combination of willpower, energy, attention to detail, and determination to transform the country under her prime ministership, which to a very large extent she did, and the country is the better for it, because even the Blair and Brown governments did not seek to reverse pretty well anything that she had initiated.
One of the, just before, when we ever mention David Cameron, we talk about the EU. You know, throughout your time in government, in the book, you described yourself as a moderate Eurosceptic. And one of the great papers reading about it that you did in 1996, you mentioned how foreign policy needs to remain the responsibility of national governments. And, you know, the white paper was very well received. Do you feel in more recent years that both Labour and Conservative governments almost didn't do enough to fight and champion issues we had in Britain with the EU before the referendum vote? Or do you think maybe the EU just didn't listen enough?
Well, I think that there was always a confusion as to what the EU's ultimate destination was intended to be. Because in my view, as a moderate Eurosceptic, or as Le Monde described me once, the French paper, as a sceptic modéré, which I was very proud to be called, you cannot create a single currency. You cannot create an internal market. You cannot create the Schengen system of free movement between borders without that being part of a momentum towards ever closer union, which is the very phrase that the EU treaties refer to. So it meant not necessarily in the short period of time, but ultimately you were moving towards some federal or quasi-federal United States of Europe, quite different to America, but nevertheless something quite different to anything Europe had experienced. Now that's really what caused Euroscepticism in Britain. That's why ultimately the referendum went the way it did. And it was always inevitable that there would be a high risk of that referendum being lost by the Remainers. Because when you think about it, throughout the 40 years of our membership, our great claims of victory were what we had prevented Britain being required to involve itself with. You're having a single currency, we are going to be exempted from that. Schengen, we are going to be exempt. European Army, not for us. It's quite difficult to say to people, we must remain in this organization, when most of your claims of achievement are what you managed to have yourself opting out of. The one big thing we were proud to be part of, and indeed Margaret Thatcher was very much part of its creation, was the internal market. But you know, that by itself turned out to be insufficient to persuade the majority of our fellow citizens to vote for our continuing membership.
Thanks for that, Sir Malcolm, and really fascinating discussion with Sir Neil. Before you go, we do have a few questions that have come in from the members.
I'll try and get short answers so we can get as many in.
Yeah, so we've got first one from Mark Robinson, who was actually an old parliamentary colleague of yours.
I remember him, yes, indeed.
He's asked, as a promoter of soft power, do you agree that the Commonwealth is an ideal vehicle for its members to share objectives? And then more specifically regarding the Institute Commonwealth Studies, which one of those kind of arms has fallen by the wayside in recent years. And I think his general question is, you know, obviously you can't probably say that much at the current stage because you're just kind of joining the inquiry, but, you know, how you see those sort of institutions as a kind of arm of soft power for the Commonwealth.
Well, you're right on the question of the future of the Commonwealth Institute. That I'm chairing the inquiry that's going to recommend either that it should continue or that it shouldn't. So I can't preempt that particular discussion, but it's very important that our terms of reference, which the University of London have agreed with us, is how best do we achieve the future of Commonwealth studies? And therefore the question is it through the Institute or in some other way? So the commitment is that Commonwealth studies should remain as a very important and vibrant part of the work that the University of London does. To reply to Mark's basic question about soft power and the value of the Commonwealth, you know, we've had a lot of controversy over the last year or so about whether the British Empire was good or bad, and whether terrible things happened, and whether we should be proud or ashamed of that. I'm not going to go into that this evening, other than to say this. It is worth asking ourselves, why did 54 countries that used to be part of the empire all decide they wanted to remain linked to each other with the Queen as head of the Commonwealth, in a Commonwealth of nations, some republics, 14 of these countries actually still having the Queen as their head of state? And therefore, whether the empire was good or bad, and I don't offer a view on that at the moment, it can't have been that bad. Otherwise, the last thing they'd have wanted to do was to have any ongoing links, particularly with the United Kingdom and its head of state. So I think that the second very short point I would make is there are many global organizations, there are many regional organizations for various parts of the world. What makes the Commonwealth unique is that it has 54 countries which transcend geographical boundaries, religious boundaries, ethnic boundaries. They really are a microcosm of the world as a whole. And therefore, most of the other countries of the world that are not involved with the Commonwealth only wish they could be part of something which, in soft power terms and cultural terms, in sharing of values, has such an ongoing role. Don't want to exaggerate it, but it would be a much sadder world if it didn't exist.
Thank you for that. Next question from Gordon Mackenzie, who actually says that you were his honorary colonel when he was commanding officer of the Edinburgh Officer Training Corps. His question is Russia just as much of a threat in that it now seeks to use cyber warfare and destabilization techniques to undermine the cohesion of Western countries whilst taking little risk to itself?
Well, I have to begin by saying I was an honorary colonel, not a real one, so that should be borne in mind. So far as Russia and cyber is concerned, yes, the question is a very good one, because essentially Putin has no interest in having a war with the United States or with Europe, partly because he would probably lose, but partly because he's not a psychopath, he's not a Hitler, he's an opportunist. And therefore the attraction to him of cyber attacks and of other ways of destabilizing other countries is that you don't have the risks that war involves and the massive devastation that war involves, but you can sometimes advance your political interests. So we have to take this as a serious threat to our security. I'm very pleased that we are doing so, both in Britain as a country, but also in the West as a whole. And we may have to be tougher than we've been up till now. But in the case of cyber, of course, you're not just trying to prevent being attacked through cyber means, you also have a potential cyber offensive capacity. So if you're attacked by countries, it sometimes is possible and necessary and justifiable to give them a taste of their own medicine.
Exactly. Next one from Nicholas Watts, who it kind of goes back to the discussion on China earlier. He asked, are there any ways in which the Commonwealth could take initiatives to engage with China in defense of democracy in Pacific small states and to address the current human rights issues, which are obviously in the news today around China?
Well, with regard to China, the single most important country, other than China itself, is a Commonwealth country, which is India. And what has been remarkable and what should cause Xi Jinping to reconsider his behavior is, during the whole of the Cold War, India, under successive governments, refused to take sides, refused to be either pro-Western or pro-Soviet. They said, we are non-aligned. That was the very phrase, that we are neutral, the phrase that was used. Such has been China's aggression towards India. And you saw some 20 Indian soldiers were killed in a border dispute just about a year or so ago, that the Indian government have dropped that approach. And they are now working very closely with Japan, with the United States, with Australia, with other Asian countries to have greater cooperation in what is now called not just the Indian or the Pacific Ocean, it's the Indo-Pacific region, that whole region that goes around the borders of China, all of whom are suffering from Chinese aggression. So India and Japan, a few months ago, a year ago, had joint naval exercises for the first time in their history. What on earth do India and Japan have in common except China? And Vietnam now, of all countries, says we are closer to the United States than we are to China, although Vietnam is supposed to be a communist country. So I don't think the Commonwealth as an organization has a role, but I think that India, Australia, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Malaysia are all major Bangladesh Commonwealth countries, as well as all the islands of the Pacific and New Zealand. So the Commonwealth indirectly is involved in this issue. And I think we're all likely to see much greater cooperation, because they've all been on the receiving end of a very intolerant Chinese government, which is very sad. It's not the relationship with China that we used to have.
Yeah, I think one final, linked question to that before I pass back over to Sunil to sum up. In the last hour before the event kicked off, we saw US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo declaring that China was committing genocide against the Uyghur Muslims. Do you believe that today's amendment to the trade bill in the House of Lords should go through or not? And what do you think the UK government could or should do regarding the persecution of that's going on in China at the moment?
I think there's no doubt that the Chinese government is responsible for disgraceful atrocities, particularly against the Uyghurs. A couple of million people incarcerated for no reason but for their ethnic and religious background, evidence of some sterilization being used and so forth. I'm a tiny bit reluctant to conclude that that is necessarily best described as genocide, because we used to believe that genocide is when you actually try and physically destroy, murder, kill a whole community, a whole population. However, I think what can be said, which is consistent with what is already known to be happening, is an attempt at cultural genocide. What they are basically trying to do is not kill every Uyghur, or so far as we know, but what they are trying to do is destroy their culture, their identity, their language, their religion, their way of life. And cultural genocide is as good a phrase as any to describe what that should be described as. And there's been various rulings by various international courts that you can use the term genocide for what I've just been describing. And in that sense, it can be supported.
Thank you for that. I'll pass back over to Sunil now just to sum up, and yeah, thank you.
So Malcolm, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on our platform. I want to tell our listeners again, Power, Pragmatism, a fantastic book that Sir Malcolm wrote, and still very relevant today. It's been an absolute honor having someone so much pedigree in British politics, someone who served our country 18 years in a row as an MP, and still able to offer such great insights into what's going on today. Hopefully we'll be able to see Sir Malcolm again sometime soon, and maybe we'll be able to do this one day actually in person in the hopefully near future. But yeah, it's been fantastic. Thank you for everyone tuning in. This has been recorded, so if you did miss some of it, we will be up on our YouTube channel as well as our Spotify and other streaming platforms. Once again, thank you to all of our listeners, and thank you, Sir Malcolm.
Thank you very much.